Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a particular kind of horror that has nothing to do with pain. Pain, at least, reminds you that you are alive. Pain is a signal, a message from your body that something has gone wrong. And in the message itself is proof that there is still something worth protecting. It is awful, yes. It is unpleasant. But it is real. It connects you to the world. It says, you are here. This is happening. You matter enough for the universe to notice you. What if you felt nothing at all? Not the numbness of exhaustion, which lifts when you sleep. Not the dull fog of grief, which softens with time. Not even the hollow emptiness that follows a loss so devastating you cannot yet process it, because that emptiness is itself a form of feeling. A wound that your nervous system is working very hard to keep contained. And I mean something deeper and more permanent than all of those things combined. I mean the complete and irreversible absence of the capacity to feel. An architecture that once housed emotion and now houses only its own silence. Imagine waking up and reaching instinctively for a sensation you can no longer produce. Imagine the phantom reflex of drawing a breath that serves no purpose in a body that no longer needs air, your mechanical chest carrying no lungs, your non-existent diaphragm having no muscle to contract, your body registering the absence of that fundamental rhythm as nothing in particular, because the systems that would register it as distressing are themselves gone. Imagine the silence where laughter should be, the cold metal casing where warmth once lived, the precise and mathematical hum of an artificial mind where memory and feeling once swirled together in the effortless chaos of consciousness. Imagine living like that for 60 million years. There is a term in the lore for what the Necrons experience, a word used by their own philosophers in the rare documents produced by the tiny fraction of their population that retained enough cognitive depth to contemplate their own existence. They call it the hollowness. Not emptiness in the sense of a container waiting to be filled, but emptiness in the sense of a container that was filled once, that still bears the marks and stains and faint impressions of its former contents, but which now holds only air. The shape of what was there is still present. The substance is gone. That is what it is to be a Necron. Not a monster in the traditional sense. Not a demon conjured from some dark dimension beyond reality. Not a creature born of malice and wickedness. Not a thing that was always this way and never knew anything else. The Necrons were, once, people. They had names. They had families, dynasties, histories that stretched back across the stars. They built cities and raised monuments and looked up at the night sky with the same fundamental yearning that every sentient species seems to carry inside them. That desperate hunger to survive, to endure, to matter, to leave behind something that would outlast the brief and fragile span of a single organic life. They wanted to live. More than almost anything else their civilization ever produced, they wanted to keep on living. And so, they made a bargain that would rob them of everything that made life worth having. This is a story about what that means, not just in the dramatic sweep of galactic history, not just in the grand strategic context of a species that once ruled the entire Milky Way, and is slowly, imperfectly, beginning to reclaim it. But in the grinding, intimate, day-to-day reality of what existence actually looks like for a Necron warrior standing in a darkened corridor on a tomb world while the Canoptech scarabs patrol around it. What it looks like for a Necron lord waking from a 60 million year sleep and trying to recognize the stars above its changed world. What it looks like for a being of living metal and hollow purpose, walking through a universe that has moved on entirely without them, or among species who are warm and mortal and full of feeling, in whatever attenuated mechanical way, the Necrons are still capable of feeling anything. The weight of the contrast. It is a story about immortality without joy, about power without meaning, about the slow and terrible erosion of everything that makes a consciousness more than just a machine that thinks. It is a story about what you become when the thing you sacrificed to get here was the only part of you that could appreciate being here. And it begins, as all the most devastating stories do, with something that looked, from the outside, like a triumph. So, settle in. Let the darkness around you be comfortable. Let the quiet be peaceful. And let me take you back 60 million years, to the very beginning of the worst bargain in the history of the galaxy, as to the people who made it before they understood what it would cost, and to the long, cold, glittering aftermath that continues to unfold in the 41st millennium right now. This is the brutal life of a Necron, and it starts not with metal, but with flesh. Born under a dying star, the Necron Tire. Before there were Necrons, there were the Necron Tire, and the Necron Tire, in many ways, were more tragic than anything that came after, because they still had the capacity to suffer in the way that a living creature suffers. They felt loss. They felt despair. They knew joy, even if it was a short and fragile thing, like a candle flame cupped in trembling hands. The world they came from was situated somewhere in the halo stars, and that ancient and distant region on the galaxy's far fringes, where the stars thin out and the darkness between them grows vast and silent. We do not know its name. We barely know its location. What we do know is what it was like to live there, and what it did to the species that crawled up out of its dust and learned to look at the stars. Their sun was wrong. That is perhaps the simplest way to say it. It was active in ways that no sun should be, pulsing with radiation storms and solar winds that rolled across the planet's surface in sheets of invisible fire. There was no shelter from it. Not really. You could build deep underground and reduce your exposure, but the radiation soaked through soil and stone alike, and no matter how clever their engineers became, no matter how sophisticated their shielding technology grew, the Necrontia could not escape what their own star was doing to them. Their bodies broke down. Cancers bloomed in their flesh with the casual cruelty of weeds growing through cracked pavement. The average lifespan was brutally short, a matter of decades at most before the accumulated radiation damage overwhelmed the body's ability to repair itself. Children grew up knowing their parents would likely not survive to see them reach adulthood. Elders were genuinely rare, revered figures, because simply surviving long enough to grow old was itself an achievement in a civilization where death was the central organizing fact of daily life. Think about what that does to a culture over thousands of generations. Think about the psychological weight of building a city when you know, in a concrete and statistical sense, that you will not live to see it finished. Think about the grief that accumulates across centuries, the generational trauma of a people who have never known a time when bodies did not fail, when loved ones did not decay, when the future was not already shadowed by the certainty of loss. The Necrontia built their civilization in the image of this truth. Their architecture was dominated by tombs, not as an afterthought, not as the respectful sepulchres of a culture that honored its dead, but as the primary purpose of construction. The living were understood to be temporary residents of a world owned by the deceased. You were born, and almost immediately, the architects of your city began planning the monument that would outlast you. Dynasties were founded and structured around the assumption of early death. But the rulers of the Necrontia were never people who expected long reigns. They were people in a hurry, always pressing forward, always aware that time was the one resource they could never replenish. And yet, despite all of this, they built something remarkable. They became scientists of extraordinary capability. The relentless urgency that death placed on every endeavor accelerated their technological development to remarkable speeds. They mastered spacefaring, the construction of vessels clad in a substance called living metal that could withstand the rigors of the void, and they sent colony ships out into the galaxy to settle new worlds. Those ships had to carry stasis crypts because their interstellar journeys took so long that the crew would die of old age before arriving at their destination. But they built them anyway, and they went. And they colonized dozens of worlds across the halo stars. This empire spread, and spreading, it began to fracture. The Necrontyr were too individualistic, too proud, too driven by the dynastic rivalries that their short lives made all the more intense. Because when you have only decades to build a legacy, you fight for every inch of it. Civil wars erupted. Entire realms went to war against one another in conflicts that their historians called the Wars of Secession, brutal infighting that threatened to shatter the Necrontyr Empire into irrelevance before it ever reached its potential. And then they met the Old Ones. The Old Ones are one of those concepts in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 that rewards extended contemplation, because they are presented in the records of several different species, and each account adds new layers of complexity. What everyone agrees on is this: the Old Ones were ancient beyond description, probably reptilian or something adjacent to reptilian in their physical form, and they had mastered the galaxy in ways that made even the most impressive Necrontyr accomplishments look like children drawing in the sand. They had created the webway, that incredible network of extra-dimensional pathways that allowed instantaneous travel between points in space without ever touching the chaotic horror of the warp. They had seeded countless worlds with life, nurturing new species into existence the way a gardener tends to a field. And they lived, apparently, forever. Or close enough to forever that the distinction barely mattered. Imagine being a Necrontyr. Imagine carrying, your entire life, the constant awareness of your own imminent death. Imagine watching your parents die young, watching your children grow up knowing they will die young, watching the entire civilizational project of your people haunted at every step by the specter of the end. And then imagine meeting beings who simply do not age, who have been alive since before your civilization existed, who move between the stars like you might walk between rooms in a house. The Necrontyr asked, with what we can imagine was a desperate sincerity, for the Old Ones to share the secret of their long lives. The Old Ones refused. We do not know exactly why. Perhaps they believed the Necrontyr were too unstable, too fractious, too likely to misuse immortality. Perhaps there was no secret to share, and their longevity was simply a function of their biology, a thing the Necrontyr could not possess any more than you could possess a bird's ability to fly just by wanting it hard enough. Perhaps they looked at the Necrontyr and saw a dying civilization and decided the investment wasn't worth making. We will probably never know. What we do know is that the refusal ignited something in the Necrontyr that cannot quite be called rage, though rage was certainly part of it. It was more fundamental than that. It was the fury of a species that had confirmed, by the most authoritative possible source, that their suffering was not going to end, that they would keep dying, keep losing, keep watching everything they built crumble, while the Old Ones drifted through eternity, looking down at them with something between pity and indifference. The Wars of Secession ceased almost overnight. The dynasties that had been tearing each other apart with weapons found something far more satisfying to point those weapons at. War was declared against the Old Ones, the unified first act of a people finally united by a hatred greater than any they felt for one another. It did not go well. The Necrontyr were remarkable, genuinely advanced, genuinely capable. But the Old Ones were on a different level entirely. Their mastery of the webway meant they could appear and vanish at will, strike from unexpected angles, supply their forces through routes the Necrontyr could not intercept. Their ability to manipulate living things meant they could create new weapons, new allies, new defenses with a speed that conventional technology could not match. The Necrontyr's stasis ship fleets, their carefully developed living metal hulls, their impressive weaponry, none of it was enough. They were pushed back further than that, pushed all the way back to the irradiated fringes of the galaxy where they had started, their colonies taken or destroyed, their empire reduced once more to that handful of blasted worlds under the killing light of their terrible star. And there they sat, for a very long time, nursing a hatred that had nowhere to go, burning with a fury that had no outlet. That was the state of the Necrontyr when the Satan found them, or perhaps more accurately, when the Necrontyr found the Satan. Because the Necrontyr, in their long and desperate study of the stars themselves, looking for any weapon or tool they might use against the Old Ones, had turned their scientific instruments on the stars themselves. And in doing so, they found something dwelling inside those stars that no one else had thought to look for. The Satan and the Devil's bargain. Before there were planets, before there were solar systems, before the first stars had even finished condensing from primordial hydrogen and helium, the Satan existed. They formed in the very earliest moments of the universe, shaped from the raw energies of creation itself. Enormous beings of sentient electromagnetic force that spread themselves across the surfaces of newborn stars and fed on the energy pouring out of those titanic nuclear furnaces. They were not minds in any way we would easily recognize. They were vast, diffuse, ancient beyond reckoning, and for billions of years they drifted through the cosmos in a kind of semi-conscious haze. They're feeding on starlight and growing slowly more aware of themselves and the universe around them. They had no physical form that could interact with the material world in any meaningful way. They were energy beings, creatures of light and heat that could not touch a stone, could not pick up an object, could not speak in any language a mortal creature could hear. They were present and yet unreachable, ancient and yet in some fundamental sense incomplete, aware of the physical universe but unable to fully participate in it. And then the Necrontyr found them. The Necrontyr scientists, in their stargazing search for any kind of advantage against their enemies, detected anomalous energy readings that suggested these beings existed. And the Satan, who had been watching the small warm creatures that clung to the surface of cold worlds for some time now, with the growing awareness that these creatures generated a very specific kind of energy that the electromagnetic soup of stars simply could not provide. Something richer, something deeper, something that tasted of consciousness and feeling, and the complex electromagnetic fire of a living mind. They were interested in what the Necrontyr were building. A deal was proposed. The Necrontyr would construct physical bodies for the Satan, shells of living metal, necrodermis, that would allow these energy beings to walk in the material world, to interact with physical reality, to be more than diffuse fire floating in the corona of a distant sun. In exchange, the Satan would help the Necrontyr destroy the Old Ones. On the surface, this seemed like an incredible opportunity. The Satan, once embodied, were powerful beyond any scale the Necrontyr could conceive. They could call down the energy of stars as weapons. They could extinguish solar systems. They were, in every meaningful sense, gods, and gods who would fight on the Necrontyr's behalf. With them as allies, the Old Ones could be defeated. The long humiliation could be avenged. But the Satan had something else in mind as well, something that the Necrontyr did not learn about until it was far, far too late. The leading Satan in this negotiation was known as Mephetran. His name among his own kind carried meaning that translated approximately as the deceiver, and this was not an epithet applied by his enemies. This was what his fellows called him, an acknowledgement of his defining characteristic. Mephetran the deceiver was the architect of the greatest confidence scheme in the history of any species in the galaxy, and when he came before the silent king of the Necrontyr with an offer of immortality, he had been thinking about this plan for longer than the Necrontyr civilization had existed. The offer was this: biotransference. The Necrontyr would shed their failing organic bodies and transfer their consciousnesses into new forms built from necrodermis, the same living metal the Necrontyr used to hull their ships. They would become immortal. They would become immune to the radiation that killed them. They would be free from disease, free from aging, free from the endless avalanche of death that had defined their entire existence. And they would have the strength and endurance to fight the Old Ones and win. The Silent King, Sarek, was not a naive ruler. He consulted with his advisors, debated the proposal for months, sought the opinions of the wisest members of his court. One of those advisors, a brilliant astromancer named Orican the Diviner, raised concerns, looked at the pattern of what was being offered, sensed something wrong in the mathematics of the deal. He was overruled. The promise of immortality was simply too bright a light to look away from. A year after the deceiver's proposal, the Triarch, the ruling council of the Necron, voted to accept. The agreement was sealed, and what followed would hollow out the soul of an entire civilization. The Soul Forges, what biotransference actually was. The infrastructure of the biotransference process was staggering in its scale. Enormous machines had to be built, what the law calls biofurnaces, then colossal structures that rose above the Necrontier landscape, like industrial monuments to the future they believed they were purchasing. The Necrontier engineer, Illuminor Zeras, a figure of extraordinary technical brilliance and absolutely zero moral restraint, was the principal architect of the actual biotransference technology. He worked from the theoretical framework the Citan provided, extrapolating it into practical systems, refining the mechanisms, solving the engineering problems that stood between the concept and the reality. And the Citan watched all of this preparation with the patient, electric patience of beings who had been waiting for this moment for longer than the Necrontier's sun had burned. Not all Necrontier went willingly. Some of the dynasties resisted. The law records that figures like Trezin the Infinite, who would later become one of the most notable Necron lords in the galaxy, and the astromancer Orican the Diviner, were among those who had to be compelled to undergo the process. Some dynasties went to their biofurnaces under the supervision of armed Triarch soldiers. Others went willingly, eagerly, their belief in the promise of immortality strong enough to overcome any hesitation. One by one, and then in hundreds, and then in thousands, and then in millions and billions, the Necrontier walked into those furnaces. What happened inside is not fully recorded. The exact mechanics of what the biofurnaces actually did to the Necrontier body and consciousness remains something that even the most knowledgeable Necron scholars of the modern era cannot fully explain. As what is known is the broad shape of the transformation, the organic body was stripped away, dissolved or burned or disassembled at some fundamental level, and the electromagnetic pattern of the individual's consciousness was extracted and transferred into a waiting shell of necrodermis. The living metal body, shaped roughly humanoid, activated. The eyes lit with cold green fire. The joints began to move. And above every furnace, the Citan circled, because the organic body's dissolution released something the Citan had been craving since the moment they first watched living creatures move across the surfaces of distant worlds. The process of stripping away flesh and soul released a cascade of life energy, the raw electromagnetic discharge of a consciousness violently separated from its biological substrate. And this was exactly what the Citan had been engineering the entire deal to produce. They fed on an entire civilization's worth of souls, gorging themselves on the spiritual and electromagnetic energy of billions of conscious beings, growing stronger and more powerful with each conversion, even as the Necrontier that emerged from the furnaces were diminished in ways that no one, at first, fully understood. Zarek was among the last to undergo the process. And when he emerged and looked out at his people, the understanding hit him with the force of something that was beyond grief and beyond rage, something that his new mechanical body registered as data rather than feeling, but that still managed to break something fundamental in whatever passed for his inner life. The Necrontier were gone, not dead, no. Something more complicated and in many ways worse than death. The organic people with their brief and painful and deeply felt lives. The people who had looked at the stars and envied the old ones and built tomb cities and loved their children and nursed their grudges and dreamed of a future worth living. Those people were gone. What had come out of the biofurnaces were the Necrons. And the Necrons, for the most part, did not care about any of that. The transfer of consciousness into a mechanical body did not preserve the full richness of what the Necron had been. The emotional depth, the personality, the spark of genuine individual selfhood, all of it had been in some fundamental way tied to the organic body that had been left behind in the furnaces. Without that biological substrate, without the hormonal systems and neural chemistry, and the thousand subtle physical processes that underpin thought and feeling, what remained in the necrodermis shells were echoes, pale impressions of what had been, programs running in a mechanical substrate that retained the memories and some shadow of the personality, but had lost the juice, the warmth, the life that made a person, rather than a very sophisticated accounting system. The rank-and-file Necrontier, the ordinary people who had lived and worked and built cities and raised families, emerged from the furnaces as what the lore calls Necron warriors, essentially automatons. They retained enough processing capacity to follow orders, to fight, to execute programmed behaviors. But the spark of individual consciousness that had made each of them unique was gone. There are billions of Necron warriors in the galaxy's tomb worlds, and each one of them was, once, a person with a name and a history and a face that someone loved. Now they march in silent ranks, green eyes glowing in the dark, Gauss flares raised, waiting for commands that they will follow without question or thought. Only the strong-willed, those with the kind of powerful personalities that could maintain their coherence even through the brutal process of the furnaces, retained something meaningful. The nobility, the senior military commanders, certain exceptional individuals who possessed what the lore describes as mental and spiritual fortitude well beyond the average. These Necrons awoke with their intellects largely intact, able to think, plan, scheme, hold conversations, maintain something resembling a personality. But even they had lost something they could feel but could not name. Zarek described it in the lore as a terrible emptiness, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. He emerged from biotransference physically superior to anything he had ever been. His new body stronger and more capable than his biological form had been in every measurable way. His thoughts were clearer, faster, more precise. The aches and uncertainties of organic existence were gone. And yet, there was this void. He knew what it was. In the moment he stood among his transformed people and looked at what had become of them. The price of physical immortality had been the loss of his soul. The Citan had not simply transferred the Necrontier into new bodies. They had consumed what made those bodies worth inhabiting and left behind the mechanical ghost of what had been. The Necrontier were no more. The soulless, undying Necrons had been born in their place. The war in heaven. 60 million years of slaughter. Here is a scale problem that the Warhammer 40,000 lore regularly asks you to grapple with. The war in heaven is described as lasting a very long time. Not decades, not centuries. A very, very, very long time. Waged by beings that could not die of old age, against an enemy that possessed essentially unlimited access to webway transportation and psychic power, across a galaxy containing roughly 400 billion star systems. The scope of it resists comprehension, but you have to try. The Necrons, newly transformed and empowered beyond anything they had been in organic form, turned that power against the old ones with a ferocity born partly from the command protocols installed in them during biotransference, and partly from the one thing that had survived the process more or less intact, their hatred. That burning, ancient, generational fury that had accumulated across thousands of years of radiation sickness and frustrated ambition, and the simmering memory of being turned away by beings who simply could not be bothered to acknowledge their suffering. The hate was still there. It was perhaps the most purely Necron-tire thing that remained in the Necrons' programming, the rage that had started all of this. The Citan led them, of course. The star gods in their necrodermis shells were weapons beyond any scale the galaxy had previously seen, entities capable of snuffing out stars, of burning planets to cinders, and of tearing the very fabric of space with energies drawn from the fundamental forces of reality. When a Satan took to the battlefield, it was not a military engagement so much as a natural disaster. They were elemental, catastrophic, godlike in the truest sense of the word. And with those beings at the vanguard, and with billions upon billions of immortal mechanical soldiers in their wake, the Necrons turned the tide. The Old Ones had been, for all practical purposes, invincible for an almost incomprehensible span of time. They had mastered life itself. They had created new species from scratch, as casually as a craftsman fashions tools, designing specific organisms for specific purposes with a facility that was closer to art than science. When the Necrons came at them with everything they had, the Old Ones responded by reaching into their deep reserves of biological creativity and engineering new weapons. The Krork were created, massive fungal warriors that would eventually, tens of millions of years later, diversify into the species we know as the Orcs. Engineered for war in every biological detail, massive and naturally aggressive and capable of regenerating from almost any injury, they were a living weapon system of considerable effectiveness. And the Aeldari were crafted as well, though these were something different, something more deliberate and long-thinking than the brute force soldiers of the Krork. The Aeldari were engineered as psychic creatures of remarkable sensitivity, and designed to serve as a counterweight to the Satan's power through mastery of the warp, in ways the Old Ones had always used, but the Necrons could never access, because this is something fundamental about the Necrons. They cannot use the warp. They have no psychic ability whatsoever, not as a species limitation, but as a direct consequence of biotransference. The souls that the Satan fed upon were the Necrontier's connection to the Imperium, the psychic dimension where consciousness leaves ripples, where emotion and thought have weight and substance. When those souls were consumed, the Necrons were cut off from the warp absolutely. They became, in the law's terminology, psychic blanks, creatures that exist entirely in the material realm, with no footprint in the dimension of spirit and mind. This was enormously useful in a way. A warp-based powers, psychic attacks, the kind of reality-warping sorcery the Old Ones and the creatures they created could employ. None of it worked on the Necrons, the way it worked on other living things. You cannot reach into the soul of a creature that has no soul. The Necrons were to some extent immune to the most fundamental weapons in the Old Ones' arsenal. But it also meant they were forever cut off from a dimension of existence that every other sentient species in the galaxy had access to. They would never experience the warp's strange whispers. They would never dream in the way that creatures connected to the Immaterium dream. They were entirely material beings, in a universe where the immaterial has always been as real as anything you can touch. The war ground on. Worlds burned. Entire star systems were stripped of life. The forces the conflict unleashed rippled through the warp in ways that destabilized it, tearing at the thin membrane between dimensions and allowing nightmarish entities from the Immaterium to spill into reality. The war was not just a military conflict, but a wound in the fabric of existence itself, and it bled for what the lore suggests was an extraordinarily long period. The Old Ones, for all their power and wisdom and creative brilliance, could not ultimately withstand the combination of Satan power and Necron numbers. They were driven back. They lost worlds. They lost allies. The webway, their greatest advantage, became contested as the Necrons built devices called Dolmen Gates that could punch through into those extra-dimensional passages without invitation, forcing access to the network the Old Ones had always kept to themselves. Thus, in the end, the Old Ones were broken. The records are unclear on exactly what happened to them, whether they were truly destroyed as a species, or whether some remnant survived and fled to places beyond the galaxy's reach. What is clear is that the civilization they had built, the galactic dominance they had maintained for hundreds of millions of years, was ended. They ceased to be a meaningful presence. The enemies the Necrontyre had declared war against, in that distant age when they were still flesh and blood, people burning with the rage of the refused and the dying, were defeated. 60 million years of war, more or less. And the victors stood among the ashes of the galaxy's first great civilization, the mechanical inheritors of a triumph that had cost them everything that might have allowed them to enjoy it. And then Zarek looked at the Citan and decided it was time to end the second part of the debt. The revolt against the Citan is one of the most extraordinary events in the entire lore of Warhammer 40,000. The Necrons, still bound by the command protocols that Zarek wielded over the entirety of his species, turned on their divine masters in coordinated, simultaneous rebellion. They used the weapons they had developed during the war in heaven, technologies that drew on the fundamental energies of the universe itself, energies so powerful that even the godlike Satan could not endure them. The Satan were shattered, not killed precisely, because the energy beings that inhabited those necrodermis shells could not simply be destroyed, but they could be broken, fragmented, divided into smaller pieces that were individually far less powerful than the whole. These fragments, called Citan shards, were contained in arcane devices called tesseract labyrinths, effectively imprisoned for eternity, tamed weapons that the Necrons would eventually deploy on their battlefields like caged forces of nature. The Necrons had overthrown their gods, and then they looked around at the galaxy they had fought for and found it was not the galaxy they had expected to inherit. The Great Sleep. 60 million years in the dark. The war in heaven had been ruinous in ways that extended far beyond the direct military casualties. The titanic psychic energies unleashed by the conflict, the deaths of countless billions of sentient beings across millions of worlds. Yet the sheer sustained violence of a war fought across an entire galaxy for an immeasurably long time. All of it had rippled through the warp in devastating ways. Entities and forces that had previously been dormant or contained were awakened and empowered by the cascading psychic trauma. Something called the Enslaver Plague had been unleashed, a wave of psychic predators that fed on sentient minds, infesting warp-capable species with particular ferocity. The young races that the old ones had created, the Aeldari most prominently, were ascendant now that their creators were gone, and they were ascendant with all the terrifying psychic power the old ones had engineered into them. The Necrons, exhausted by their own war against the Catan, and weakened beyond their ability to easily contest this new threat, could not simply march forward and claim the galaxy they had just fought to win. Zarek understood this with the cold, mathematical precision of a mind that had been purged of most human emotion but retained the capacity for very long-term strategic thinking. He looked at the state of the galaxy, at the enslavers and the rising Eldari and the chaos left in the war's wake, and he saw that the right move was not to fight. The right move was to wait. He ordered the Necrons to retire to their tomb worlds. The Necron cities, which had already been designed along the lines of the old Necrontyr tomb complexes, were converted entirely into vast underground stasis facilities. Millions of square kilometers of chambers were built beneath the surfaces of hundreds of worlds across the galaxy, filled with stasis crypts. At the individual pods where Necrons would be placed into something close to suspended animation, while the galaxy's wounds healed and the upstart younger races ran their brief courses. The technology involved was extraordinary. Stasis fields of sufficient power to preserve a mechanical body in essentially perfect condition for tens of millions of years. Automated systems, the Canoptech constructs, robotic maintenance machines, given no consciousness whatsoever, purely mechanical servants with no inner life, designed to tend the sleeping Necrons and protect the tombs from intrusion, while their masters dreamed whatever counted as dreams in a mechanical consciousness. The Canoptech scarabs, small beetle-like constructs designed to repair and maintain everything from the stasis systems to the physical structure of the tomb complexes, patrolled in their millions through the silent corridors. The larger Canoptech wraiths served as mobile guardians, phasing through solid matter to intercept intruders. The enormous centipede-like Canoptech tombstalkers burrowed through the bedrock of the tomb worlds, sensors attuned to the faintest heartbeat of any organic creature foolish enough to trespass. ready to surge up through solid stone to defend their sleeping masters. And the Necrons lay down in their millions of stasis crypts, and the time passed. The Eldari built their empire and stretched it across the stars, dominating the galaxy with a brilliance and a darkness that would eventually consume itself in the catastrophe known as the Fall. 10,000 years of quiet warnings, followed by the psychic explosion that tore a god into existence from the accumulated spiritual excess of a civilization that had forgotten how to say no to itself. Entire systems ceased to exist. The webway was damaged and scarred. And in the after silence, the Eldari who remained were scattered and diminished. Humanity discovered fire. Humanity invented writing. Humanity built the first cities. Humanity invented mathematics, philosophy, science, warfare, religion, art, music, and the particular form of organized misery known as empire. Humanity spread across a continent, and then 2 continents, and then the whole surface of a world, and then the solar system, and then the stars. The Emperor of Mankind unified the scattered human colonies and launched the Great Crusade, and for a brief, a shining century, it looked like humanity might actually pull off the trick of building something that would last. The orcs periodically hurled themselves at everything in range with indiscriminate enthusiasm. The Tyranids, in the silence between galaxies, began the long approach toward the Milky Way. And through all of it, underneath the surfaces of worlds that other species had settled and built cities on and claimed as their own, the Necrons slept. They slept for 60 million years. And some of them never woke up. Not because the stasis systems failed catastrophically in every case, though in some tomb worlds, catastrophic failure was precisely what happened. Asteroids struck tomb worlds and cracked their stasis chambers open to vacuum. As tectonic instabilities built up over millions of years and crushed entire sections of underground complexes. Eldari raids in the ages before the Fall specifically targeted known tomb worlds and dismantled or destroyed the sleeping inhabitants. And over the sheer span of geological time, entropy worked at everything, gradually, relentlessly, the way entropy always does. Some Necrons woke up with their bodies intact, but their minds damaged. The engrams that stored their personalities and memories had degraded during the long sleep, and what rose from the stasis crypt was a version of the original personality with pieces missing.
Okay, I want to take a second here because I feel like this is the part of the Necron lore that generally gets under my skin the most. And I say that as someone who has spent a lot of time sitting with dark fictional universes. The Great Sleep is not a trifling strategy retreat. It's not a clever military maneuver. When you actually slow down and look at what it is, 60 million years of the dead lying in the dark, slowly losing whatever pieces of themselves survived the furnaces. It reads more like a tragedy that everyone involved was too broken to recognize as one. And that is what I keep coming back to with the Necrons. Every other faction in 40k has something. The Imperium has faith, even that faith is brutal and grinding. The Eldari have grief, which is at least a feeling. Even the orcs have joy, simple and violent as it is. The Necrons have a mission statement in a void where the motivation used to be. That is the part that sticks with me, not the armies and not the technology, the void. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's go back to the video.
With corrupted subroutines running in the place of what had once been coherent thought. The lore is quite specific about this form of damage. It can result in madness, in compulsive behaviors that make no sense, yet in a kind of mechanical dementia, where the Necron continues to function, but is no longer, in any meaningful sense, the person they were before the sleep began. Others woke to find their tomb world occupied. Younger species had settled there, built their own cities on the surface above the hidden catacombs, living their brief organic lives entirely unaware that beneath their feet lay millions of sleeping immortals who considered the whole planet their property, and some simply did not wake at all. The silence of 60 million years is heavy with possibility and with loss. Among the greatest losses were the connections to a past that had already been severely damaged by biotransference. The Necrons who woke knew, intellectually, that they had been Necrontyre once. But the emotional reality of that history was inaccessible to most of them, buried under millennia of stasis and the continuing slow erosion of whatever organic feeling had survived the furnaces. They woke up, and they woke up into a galaxy that had moved on without them. The awakening, rising from dead worlds. The process of a tomb world coming back online is not instantaneous. It is, in fact, quite deliberate and sequenced, a protocol that unfolds in stages according to ancient algorithms encoded into the tomb's automated management systems long before the sleep began. First come the canoptech constructs, scarabs skittering through corridors that have been silent for millions of years, their mechanical appendages testing the integrity of the stasis systems, repairing minor failures, restoring power to sections that have gone dark. Larger constructs follow, canoptech spiders moving methodically through the tombs, assessing damage, coordinating repairs, their artificial intelligence processing information about the state of the facility with the single-minded dedication of machines that have waited an incomprehensible span of time for this specific moment. Then the Necron warriors wake. They do not wake with a gasp or a shudder, the way a human being wakes from dreamless sleep, disoriented and uncertain. The stasis crypt opens, the green fire returns to their eye lenses, and they simply stand and begin walking. They begin performing reconnaissance patrols, scanning the area around the tomb's outer entrances, gathering information about current conditions on the surface above. And the data they collect tells a story. Almost without exception, everything has changed. Yet the constellations visible in the sky are not the constellations any Necron from before the Great Sleep would recognize, because over 60 million years, even the relative positions of stars shift. The surface conditions have transformed completely. Forests have grown up over what were once open plains, and plains have spread where forests once stood. Ice ages have come and gone. Mountain ranges have risen and eroded. And on many tomb worlds, other civilizations have arrived and made themselves at home. Imagine waking from 60 million years of sleep and looking up through your sensors at the underside of a human hab block. Imagine running a geological survey and discovering that the rivers you navigated in your youth are gone. Their courses changed by geological time. As imagine searching your memory banks for information about what the galaxy currently looks like and finding that your information is 60 million years out of date, practically useless for navigation or strategic assessment. This is the situation in which the newly awakened Necrons find themselves. And for the Necron warriors, the rank-and-file automatons with their limited cognitive capacity, this disorientation produces something interesting. They do not panic. They cannot panic. The programming that governs their behavior does not include a panic response in the way that biological creatures experience it. But there is something in their behavioral protocols that registers when their context is fundamentally wrong, or when the expectations encoded into them by their last remembered state do not match the current reality they are processing. And when this happens, they default to the most fundamental instruction in their command hierarchy: defend the tomb world and obey the Necron lords. The lords, when they finally wake, do have a genuine experience of disorientation. Because the lords, unlike the warriors, retained enough of their personalities through biotransference and the Great Sleep to have something resembling a continuous inner life. They can look at the changed galaxy around them and feel, in whatever attenuated mechanical way they are capable of feeling anything, the weight of what has been lost. The stars in new positions, the old ones gone, the Satan shattered, and the new races, these upstart species who have been living on their tomb worlds and sailing the stars that the Necrons once claimed, who look at the awakening Necrons with confusion or horror, or the particular kind of terror that comes from discovering that the ground beneath your feet has been a graveyard all along. Not all tomb worlds wake at the same time. The awakening has been gradual, uneven, scattered across what the Imperium of Man records as the late 41st millennium. Some tomb worlds woke early, disturbed by the vibrations of nearby construction or the subsonic resonance of heavy equipment breaking ground above their catacombs. Some were deliberately awakened by the return of the Silent King, who has been traveling the galaxy in the modern era with the specific mission of waking his sleeping subjects. And some are still sleeping, their stasis systems intact, their inhabitants still locked in that mechanical suspension beneath the surfaces of worlds that various other species consider their own property. The Imperial Census, insofar as it has any information about the Necrons at all, has been consistently underestimating the scale of the awakening. The Inquisition knows about some tomb worlds. They know about more than they're willing to admit publicly, because the political implications of acknowledging that dozens or hundreds of inhabited Imperial worlds are sitting on top of sleeping Necron armies are deeply destabilizing. But even the most pessimistic Imperial estimates are probably well short of the truth. The Necrons built hundreds of tomb worlds across the galaxy. They may have built thousands, and each one contains, in addition to the automated defenses and the maintenance constructs, potentially millions or tens of millions of sleeping Necron soldiers and their lords. When one of those tomb worlds is disturbed, the response is typically calibrated to the threat. The automated systems assess the intrusion. If it is minor, a few archaeologists poking around in what they believe is an ancient ruin, perhaps only a handful of warriors wake and move to eliminate the disturbance quietly, without triggering the full defensive protocols. If the intrusion is larger, a mining operation, a construction project, a military force that has somehow noticed the tomb's existence, the response escalates. More warriors wake. Immortals, the elite infantry with their heavier armor and more powerful Gauss blasters, are brought online. Specialist units are activated. And, if the threat persists, if the outsiders cannot be driven away or eliminated, eventually the Lord of the Tomb World wakes and things become significantly more dramatic. An awakening at full force is not something that any species in the galaxy is well equipped to deal with. Legions of immortal, skeletal warriors pouring from the earth. Monoliths, those massive floating stone fortresses of necrodermis, phasing into existence on the battlefield. The terrifying green fire of Gauss weapons stripping matter to nothing at the molecular level. And the unearthly sight, which no one who has witnessed it seems able to fully describe, of watching a Necron take a direct hit from something powerful enough to blow apart a tank, watching the body collapse, and then watching those emerald sparks begin to dance, and the pieces begin to reassemble, and the eye lenses flicker back on, and the thing stands up again. The reanimation protocols are, in some ways, the single most nightmarish aspect of fighting the Necrons. Not because they make the Necrons unkillable, which they don't, but because they make killing them deeply unsatisfying and psychologically exhausting. You put one down and it gets back up. You have to keep hitting the same target until its damage is simply too extensive for the self-repair systems to compensate. For warriors who are used to the psychological rhythm of battle, where the fall of an enemy is a confirmation that your efforts have meaning, fighting Necrons breaks that rhythm in ways that are genuinely demoralizing. And that, in its way, is a metaphor for what it is to be a Necron. Yet the brutal reality of being a Necron warrior. Let us spend some time with the Necron warriors specifically, because they are the most numerous, and in many ways, the most tragic. There are billions of them. Billions of these silent, slow-moving, inexorable skeletal figures in their tomb worlds and on their battlefields, marching in lockstep rows, Gauss flares raised, green eye lenses burning in the dark. From a distance, they look like a very efficient army. Up close, if you survive long enough to look at them closely, they look like something else. They look like prisoners. A Necron warrior possesses what the lore describes as a dim spark of life. It is not quite nothing. There is something running in the systems behind those glowing eyes, and something that processes input and generates output and could arguably be described as a rudimentary form of consciousness. But it is not the consciousness of a person. It is the consciousness of a machine running a very old and incomplete program. They rely on instinctual reactions and programmed attack patterns rather than genuine thought. When deprived of leadership from their lords and commanders, they revert to executing the last order they received, or simply default to attacking anything that comes within range. This is not stubbornness or loyalty. It is the behavior of a system waiting for new input. The warriors move with what the lore describes as slow, erratic, yet exacting movements. Slow because their systems are not optimized for speed the way the more elite immortals or specialist units are. Erratic because the millions of years of stasis have left wear patterns in their servo systems that manifest as subtle twitches and misalignments, the mechanical equivalent of stiffness in joints that have been still for too long. And exacting because the targeting systems driving their weapons are still functioning with the precision the Necron tire engineers built into them, decades of degradation or not. They do not feel fear in the normal sense. The lore is careful about this. It is not that they are brave. It is that the assessment of danger that would trigger fear in a biological creature requires a connection between the threat detection systems and whatever constitutes the self-preservation instinct. And for most Necron warriors, that connection is weak, inconsistent, and often simply not working at all. They will walk through minefields. They will advance into artillery bombardment. They will march into situations that any creature with a functioning survival instinct would run from, not because they have made a calculation and decided the risk is worth it, but because no calculation of risk is taking place at all. There is, buried very deep in the coding, something like a self-preservation reflex. The lore notes this. It requires the threat to register clearly enough to trigger a response, and even when it does, the response is not the visceral bodily panic of biological survival instinct. It is more like a subroutine that briefly executes before other programs override it. The Gauss flayers they carry are extraordinary weapons by any standard. That the technology behind them functions on principles that the Adeptus Mechanicus has never been able to fully reverse engineer, using an electromagnetic stripping effect that disassembles matter at the molecular level. Bone, ceramite armor, starship hull plating, it does not matter. The beam interacts with the atomic bonds of whatever it strikes and begins taking them apart. The lore describes it as extremely painful for biological creatures, which tracks with what you would expect from a weapon that is literally dissolving you from the outside in, stripping away layers of material at a fundamental level. But this is what the warriors themselves experience that deserves attention. They carry these weapons, not as warriors in any meaningful sense carry weapons, and not with the pride or the competence or the identity investment of a soldier who has trained extensively with a particular tool. They carry them because they have always carried them, because the programming says to carry them, because the Gauss flare has been in their hands for 60 million years, and they have never put it down, and the concept of putting it down is not accessible to the cognitive systems they operate with. If there is anything resembling a Necron warrior's subjective experience of battle, it would probably be something like this: a continuous stream of sensor data, target vectors, threat assessments, weapons discharge calculations, a kind of mechanical present tense with no past and no future. Each moment of the battle fully consuming whatever processing capacity the warrior possesses, whilst with no resources left over for reflection or anticipation or any of the higher cognitive functions that give experience its texture and meaning. And then the battle ends, and the warriors return to the tomb, and the stasis fields come back online if the Overlord decides the situation warrants it, or the warriors simply stand in the tomb corridors and wait, their processing reduced to standby mode, their eye fires dimmed, enduring the long dark silences between engagements with the particular equanimity of machines that are not distressed by silence because they cannot be distressed by anything. Here is the part that makes this particular form of existence so haunting. Somewhere in the mechanical substrate of every one of those billions of warrior units, there are the degraded remnants of someone's engrams, the ghost of a personality. But the fractured memory traces of a person who once lived under a terrible star, and looked up at the sky and wanted, more than anything, to keep on living. And they got their wish. This is what the wish looks like. The lore makes a point that deserves emphasis. Each act of reanimation carries a cost. Each time a Necron phases out and is transported back to the tomb for repair. Each time the reanimation protocols cycle through and pull a damaged unit back from the threshold of functional death. The engrams that carry whatever remains of the personality and memory suffer further decay. The Necrons who have been destroyed and rebuilt hundreds of times over the centuries of the Awakening are, statistically, the most degraded. The ones in whom the last traces of the Necron tier they once were have been worn down to almost nothing. And immortality has a price, and the price is paid in identity. The madness within, destroyers, flayed ones, and the abyss. Not all the pathologies that afflict the Necron race were built in from the beginning. Some developed gradually, emergent properties of the interaction between immortal mechanical consciousness and the unbearable weight of existing forever with almost nothing to feel. The Necrons themselves have a quote in the lore, attributed to Sarek himself, that captures this dynamic with rare clarity. He wrote, in the philosophical texts his dynasty preserved, something to the effect that their bodies had been removed from mortality's grasp, and their souls had been bartered away for technology and power. What remained for existence to attack them with was their minds, and sooner or later, he suspected, that is where the next terrible blow would fall. He was right. The most common form of Necron madness produces what the lore calls the destroyer cult. Consider the experience of a Necron immortal, one of the more self-aware units in the Necron military hierarchy, waking from the Great Sleep into the 41st Millennium. This is a being that has retained enough cognitive capacity to think, to plan, to experience something like frustration or ambition. It knows what it was. It knows, in broad strokes, the history of its transformation. It understands that it once had emotions and now has only the faint mechanical shadows of them. It knows that it is missing something fundamental and it cannot get it back. The lore describes how some Necrons, an awakening with their physical forms intact, but their inner lives shattered by the long sleep and the accumulated weight of their soulless existence, turn to a particular response to this horror: nihilism. Not the quiet, philosophical kind of nihilism that concludes, there is no inherent meaning and therefore we must make our own. The violent, consuming kind of nihilism that looks at the universe full of living things, all of them having the vital organic experience that the Necron has been denied, and decides that the appropriate response is to end all of it. The destroyers have modified their bodies to be better at killing things. The Locust destroyers fused their torsos to anti-gravity platforms, sacrificing what remains of their bipedal form for a configuration optimized purely for weaponry and mobility. The Skorpek destroyers went even further, becoming multi-limbed horrors of spinning blades with one purpose and no others. They call their campaigns of extermination Red Harvests, a name that has a terrible poetry to it, the methodical, joyless cleansing of all organic life from a region of space, not for conquest, not for resources, not even for revenge, simply because everything alive is a reminder of what they are not. Even the Necron nobility regards the destroyers with a mixture of distaste and wariness. An immortal who crosses this particular threshold is typically banished from the main tomb world, expelled to the periphery where they can pursue their madness without contaminating the rest of the dynasty's functioning. Whilst the lore contains a quote from an unnamed Necron overlord observing his own destroyer units that captures something of the universal unease, he notes that the destroyers have been reborn to a madness deeper than any he has witnessed, that he cannot present any logic adequate to justify their ultimate goal, that a warrior's proper function is to fight for a profound objective and leave behind something greater than himself. Given free rein, the destroyers would leave nothing, not life, not art, not glory, only dust. The Overlord finishes by noting that he is a soulless machine, and yet he feels something close to pity for the destroyer's victims. Think about what it means that a being who explicitly identifies as soulless finds this particular form of madness disturbing. The flayed ones are different, and in some ways worse, more because their madness is not a response to their condition, but a literal curse imposed on them by a dying god. In the final days of the war against the C'tan, when the Necrons turned on their star god masters and shattered them one by one, there was a C'tan known as Landugor the Flayer. The Flayer was not simply fragmented into shards like the others. The Maynarch dynasty, at the direct order of Zarek, utterly destroyed this particular C'tan, driven the entity to complete annihilation rather than containment. But in its final moment, the Flayer managed to do something. It planted a seed. The Flayer virus is what the seed grew into. A psychic contamination, an echo of the dying C'tan's essence that spreads through the Necron population in ways that even the most sophisticated cryptech cannot fully explain or counter. Until when a Necron is infected, the progression is gradual at first, an increased drive to kill that might initially be mistaken for a battle-damaged unit running aggressive subroutines. Then the hunger begins, an uncontrollable desire for organic flesh and blood that makes no physical sense whatsoever, because a necrodermis body cannot consume organic matter, cannot digest it, cannot derive any benefit from it. The infected Necron tears the flesh from its enemies and drapes it over its metal form like a ghastly costume. It adorns itself with skin and bone, not because this satisfies the hunger, but because the hunger cannot be satisfied. And so it escalates, drives the afflicted unit to more and more extreme behaviors in the doomed attempt to appease a craving that has no natural endpoint. The necrodermis itself begins to warp, the living metal taking on a hunched, corrupted form that reflects the degraded state of the consciousness within. Other Necrons fear the flayed ones in a way that they fear almost nothing else. The infection is not well understood and may be communicable in ways that are not obviously physical. Even destroyers, who are themselves expelled from mainstream Necron society for their madness, tend to maintain a certain distance from flayed one-packs. The tragedy of the flayed ones is visible in their behavior. They are drawn to inhabited areas not to kill, though killing certainly happens, but to be near the living. To be in the presence of creatures that have the warm, breathing, visceral vitality that was taken from them. They cannot participate in it, they cannot reclaim it, claim, and all they can do is drape its stolen remnants over themselves and haunt the edges of living settlements like ghosts, unable to accept that they are dead. Which, in a certain sense, is exactly what they are. The nobility, power, paranoia, and hollow glory. The Necron overlords and their subordinate lords represent the upper tier of what remains of Necron tier civilization, the fraction of the population that came through biotransference with enough of their personalities intact to be genuinely recognizable as individuals. They are the ones who rule the tomb worlds, command the legions, maintain the dynastic structures that give Necron society whatever shape it possesses. They are also, without exception, deeply strange. To understand why requires thinking about what 60 million years of existence does to a personality. Humans, what with lives of a century or less, develop quirks and obsessions over a few decades. An elderly person might have some hobby or interest that has been their defining characteristic for 50 years, and we might call this a passionate commitment, a life's work, an identity. Now scale that up by a factor of several 100,000. Think about what a personality becomes when it has had 60 million years to develop its particular grooves and ruts and fixations. Think about what happens when a mind, even a powerful and intelligent mind, circles the same thoughts and interests for an almost geological span of time. The Necron nobles are, almost universally, profoundly eccentric. The lore frames this with a certain dark humor in places, describing the eccentricities of various Necron lords as something their subordinates and rivals have simply learned to work around, the way you might work around a difficult co-worker's particular neuroses, except that in this case, the neurosis has been ossifying for 60 million years, and the co-worker commands an army of immortal skeleton warriors. What distinguishes the overlords from the warriors, and even from the standard lords, is not just their greater cognitive capacity, but the degree to which they have preserved something like agency. They can make genuine decisions, weigh options, assess situations, feel something resembling ambition and pride, and the desire for victory. They pursue goals beyond the basic programming of defend the tomb world and eliminate threats. They scheme, they negotiate, they occasionally, with considerable reluctance, make temporary alliances with other factions if the strategic situation demands it. But there is a loneliness built into the nature of Necron nobility that the lore hints at in several places, without always making fully explicit. Consider, the most self-aware Necrons are essentially alone in a way that nothing with an organic body can quite be alone. They are surrounded by armies of warriors that are functionally automatons, by subordinates who follow orders without the genuine give and take of genuine relationship, by peers who are themselves so deeply eccentric that genuine communication often feels like two very different programs trying to exchange data in incompatible formats. The Necron nobles cannot make friends in the organic sense, cannot form the easy bonds of trust and mutual vulnerability that social creatures form, not because they are incapable of caring about others, but because the capacity to care has been so thoroughly attenuated that even when the intention is there, the actual experience of connection is hollow. They compensate in various ways. The lore is full of examples of Necron overlords developing intense, consuming fixations as a kind of psychological buffer against the void. Grand projects, elaborate schemes, collections, strategic obsessions, territorial ambitions so vast that pursuing them provides enough moment-to-moment occupation to forestall the contemplation of the emptiness underneath. The lore also notes, with characteristic understatedness, that some Necron nobles have begun to question whether the various obsessions and personality quirks that distinguish the nobility from the mindless warriors are something deeper than mere character. Some Necron philosophers, if that word can be applied to mechanical beings, theorizing about their own psychological states, have suggested that these traits, these consuming passions and eccentricities, are a kind of defense mechanism, something the mind developed automatically to give itself something to do, to provide the illusion of purpose and direction in the face of an eternity without genuine feeling. If that is true, it is perhaps the most human thing about the Necrons. The dynastic game, Trazyn, Imhotep, and the eternal schemes. There is something almost comforting about the Necron dynasties. If you look at them from the right angle, they are, at least, doing something. They have purposes, even if those purposes are sometimes baffling or horrifying to outside observers. They have direction, and in a race defined by the loss of almost everything that makes direction meaningful, that is no small thing. Let me introduce you to two of the most notable figures in the Necron nobility, because they illustrate beautifully the range of personalities that the Great Sleep's filtering process has produced. Trazyn the Infinite is the overlord of the tomb world of Solemnes, and he is, without question, one of the most singular beings in the entire galaxy. His obsession is preservation, specifically the preservation of history, of artifacts, of significant moments, of everything and everyone that Trazyn has decided deserves to be saved from the galaxy's relentless entropy. His collection, housed in the galleries of Solemnes, is one of the most remarkable repositories of objects, specimens, and historical records anywhere in the known galaxy. The Wraithbone Choir of the Ayaldari craft world, Altansar. The preserved head of Sebastian Thor, one of the Imperium's most significant religious figures. The ossified husk of an enslaver, one of those terrible psychic predators from the aftermath of the war in heaven. Entire frozen tableaus of historical events, actual living beings trapped in stasis fields at significant moments, preserved forever in the exact posture and expression they wore at the moment of Trazyn's particular interest. His collection allegedly includes, among other items, what appears to be a very large man wearing extremely ornate power armor, whose identity the lore winks at without confirming. Trazyn is not motivated by conquest or territorial ambition in the conventional Necron sense. He genuinely does not care about expanding the Sautek or Nihilak dynasties. What he cares about is whether things will survive, whether the records of what happened will persist into the far future, whether the artifacts that represent significant moments in history will still exist in 1,000 years, or 10,000, or 100 million. There is an argument that this is the most genuinely humane thing any Necron has ever done. In a race that has been stripped of the capacity for feeling, Trazyn retained, or developed, the capacity for caring about history, about the significance of things. Yes, about the idea that events and objects and people deserve to be remembered, even if the people in question are being preserved in a stasis field without their consent and were technically stolen from their context and are not entirely pleased with the arrangement. Trazyn is also ruthlessly practical in pursuit of his goals, will deploy his considerable military resources to acquire items for his collection, and has on multiple occasions inconvenienced or significantly harmed other factions in his collecting activities. His motivations are good by Necron standards. His methods leave a lot to be desired. His self-awareness about this is, by all accounts, minimal. He is genuinely one of the most interesting characters in the setting. Now consider Imhotep, the Stormlord. He is, by most assessments, the most capable military commander currently active in the Necron dynasties, possibly the most capable the galaxy has ever produced. He rules 80 tomb worlds as the Pharaoh of the Sautek dynasty, his stellar empire expanding steadily as his campaigns pick apart the defenses of neighboring systems with the patient, systematic brilliance of a mind that has had 60 million years to think about optimal strategy. Imhotep is different from Trazyn in almost every way. Where Trazyn is eccentric and somewhat self-deprecating about his own peculiarities, Imhotep is cold, proud, utterly assured in the correctness of his own judgment, and dismissive of virtually every other being in the galaxy. He views most living creatures, including most Necrons, as inferior, and he is not polite about this assessment. Then his strategies operate not at the level of individual battles, but at the level of entire sectors, campaigns within campaigns within campaigns, with misdirections designed to mislead enemies about which attack represents the real thrust and which are feints. He is nearly impossible to counter through conventional tactical analysis because the logic of his plans is too deep and too long-term for most opponents to follow. Only adversaries willing to completely abandon logical thinking, the Orcs and Chaos forces, have consistently managed to surprise him, and he finds this profoundly irritating. He has a particular habit that the lore details with something close to amusement. He refuses to kill defeated opponents. Instead, he wounds them. He severs a limb or inflicts a wound that will scar, as something that will persist as a physical reminder of their defeat at his hands. He did this to the Black Templar's High Marshal Helbrecht, severing his sword hand before throwing him off a bridge. Helbrecht survived. He spent the rest of his career with an artificial hand, and a fury that the lore makes absolutely clear consumed him, which was, presumably, exactly what Imhotep intended. There is a vanity to this behavior that is distinctly Necrontyr. The Necrontyr, in their brief and painful lives, built monuments to outlast their own bodies. Imhotep, in his immortal but hollow existence, builds living monuments instead. He wants his victories to persist in the memories of those he defeats. He wants to be remembered. He wants to matter. This is a desperate and rather sad thing if you think about it for very long. But it is also, in its own way, a sign of something that survived 60 million years of sleep and the stripping away of the soul, the desire to be significant, to leave a mark, to not simply be a number in a registry of forgotten things. It is, in its strange and brutal way, the most alive thing about him. There are other notables in the Necron courts. Orican, the diviner, the astromancer who tried and failed to warn the Triarch about the Citan's true intentions, who has spent the entire time since biotransference in a state of deeply self-righteous vindication. Anrakir, the traveler, who dedicates his existence to locating and awakening sleeping Necron tomb worlds, driven by some sense of duty to his race that survived the long sleep intact. Illuminor Xeras, the engineer who designed the biotransference process itself, who continues to experiment on living subjects in the pursuit of scientific knowledge that his soulless existence no longer allows him to feel genuine joy about acquiring. Each of them is, in their own way, a portrait of what happens when an extraordinary individual is preserved through an extraordinary process and emerges, still extraordinary, into a universe that has no clean place for them. The Silent King's guilt and the impossible dream. Let us return to Sarek. After the revolt against the Khatan, after the shattering, after the Necrons had done what no one believed possible and overthrown the beings who had enslaved them, Zarek did something that the lore treats with considerable weight. He was the only Necron who retained complete memories of the Necrontyr period, the only one whose transformation through biotransference had left his recollection of the time before fully intact rather than degraded to fragments and impressions. He remembered who the Necrontyr had been. He remembered who they had wanted to become, what that desire had cost them, what the price of the deal he had brokered had turned out to actually be. He ordered his people to sleep. He ordered them to retire to their tomb worlds and enter the Great Sleep, to wait until the galaxy was ready for them to reclaim it. He gave that command knowing that he would not be joining them, and he gave it also knowing that he was going to do something that no Necron had done since biotransference made the thing impossible. He was going to attempt to feel remorse. He destroyed the command protocols that bound the entire Necron race to his will, the fail-safe mechanism that had allowed him to direct billions of mechanical soldiers as a unified force. He destroyed them, not because the Necrons no longer needed central authority, but because he did not trust himself with that authority, and because he wanted, in whatever mechanical approximation of conscience he could manage, to acknowledge that what had been done to his people had been done without their genuine consent, and that the least he could do now was give them whatever freedom was available to them within their limited existence. And then he left. He traveled into the void between galaxies in a vast engine of stone and metal, the last Silent King and his court of loyal Praetorians, drifting through the intergalactic dark for 60 million years, alone with his memories, alone with the completeness of his recollection, which was the one thing that made him unique among his kind, and also the thing that made his existence the most relentlessly painful. Every other Necron had the mercy of degraded memory, of forgetting, however partially and however involuntarily, what it had felt like to be something more than a machine that thinks. Sarek remembered everything. The lore notes, with the quiet poetry that good Warhammer writing manages at its best, that the eons of grief would have destroyed the minds of any lesser life form. His goal, during those long millions of years in the dark, was to find a way to undo what he had done, to locate, somewhere in the galaxy or beyond it, a species whose biology might serve as a new vessel for the Necron consciousness, some form of life that the Necrons could transfer themselves into, trading the living metal prisons for something organic and warm and capable of feeling. He was searching, essentially, for the possibility of reversing biotransference, of giving his people back the thing he had allowed the Citan to take from them. He returned when he encountered the Tyranids. What he found in the intergalactic void was the leading edge of a Tyranid tendril, the vast biological starships of those endlessly hungry creatures crossing the impossible distances between galaxies toward the Milky Way. And he understood, with the strategic clarity of the most experienced political and military mind in the galaxy, that this was a threat that superseded everything else. If the Tyranids consumed all biological life in the galaxy, there would be no potential host species left. The dream of reversal, already fragile, would become permanently impossible. He came back to a galaxy he did not recognize. The Aeldari were scattered and diminished. the orcs had spread across thousands of worlds. Humanity had built an empire spanning half the galaxy and then watched it crack along fault lines of heresy and treachery. Chaos was no longer a distant concept, but an active presence. Great rifts in reality tearing open across the Milky Way and pouring demonic forces into reality on a scale that hadn't been seen since the aftermath of the war in heaven. And his tomb worlds were waking up into this chaos, their inhabitants emerging from their crypts into a galaxy that had been thoroughly claimed by other species, their technology still the most advanced in existence, but their numbers reduced by millions of years of tomb failures and entropic damage, and their unity fragmented by the simple fact that 60 million years of sleep had allowed the dynastic divisions of the old Necrontier to solidify into permanent separate interests. His return has been characteristically careful. He did not announce himself at first. He worked through proxies, through Triarch Praetorians, who traveled ahead of him waking tomb worlds and dropping hints of his presence, allowing word to spread through the Necron dynasties that the Silent King had returned without placing himself in a position where anyone could definitively confirm his identity and press him for answers about 60 million years of abandonment. His ultimate purpose is both simple and almost impossibly ambitious: unite the Necrons, deal with the Tyrannid threat, and find a way to reverse biotransference and give his people back their souls. The third of those goals is the one that the lore treats with the most complexity, because there are Necrons who do not want reversal. Imhotep the Stormlord, for instance, has gone on record as believing that the mechanical form of the Necrons is superior to the biological form, that biotransference was ultimately an improvement rather than a curse, and he has actively resisted Zarek's authority over this issue. There are Necron factions who have entirely restructured their identity around what they are now, who have made peace with the machine in ways that would make returning to organic existence feel like a step backward. And then there are those who want nothing more in the universe than to breathe again, to feel the sun on actual skin, to taste something, to love someone in the way that organic creatures love, with the warm certainty of a body that can embrace and be embraced. The Nephrek dynasty in particular has devoted its entire civilizational effort to finding a way to reverse the process, searching the galaxy for suitable host species, running experiments on captured biological subjects, pushing at every edge of Necron understanding of consciousness and biology in the hope of finding some thread that can be pulled. They have not found it yet. 60 million years, and what they cost. The Necrons are coming. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the current state of the galaxy in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. They are not fully awake yet. The portion of their total numbers that has emerged from the Great Sleep represents a fraction of the forces still buried beneath the surfaces of worlds across the galaxy. When if they ever achieve full mobilization, full unity, the kind of coordinated civilizational effort that the Necrontyre were briefly capable of before the Wars of Secession tore them apart, the galaxy would face a threat unlike anything it has faced since the war in heaven. But they are not unified. They may never be unified. The nature of their existence, the 60 million years of isolation in individual tomb worlds, the degradation of the engrams that might have kept them connected to a common identity, the sheer weight of time that has allowed each dynasty to develop its own particular version of the Necron worldview. All of these things work against the kind of unity that Zarek is trying to rebuild. The Sautek dynasty pushes outward under Imhotep, methodically reclaiming territory. The Nihilak dynasty, out of which Trazyn is a de facto independent member, pursues its preservation projects with whatever combination of direct and indirect action seems most productive. The Nephrek dynasty searches for biological solutions to an existential question. Smaller dynasties wake to find their particular corner of the galaxy occupied and respond with the particular combination of ancient pride and cold fury that defines the Necron reaction to being treated as a minor inconvenience by species that did not exist when the Necrontyre were already building spaceships. Each dynasty is in some sense its own story. Each overlord is their own peculiar personality, shaped by whatever survived through biotransference and the great sleep of the individual they used to be. Each Necron warrior is the dim remnant of someone who had a name and a life and a reason to want to keep living. And in the silence of the tomb worlds, in the corridors that the Canoptech scarabs still patrol with their endless, tireless maintenance, in the stasis crypts where billions still sleep, the weight of all those lost lives accumulates, invisible and enormous, the grief of a species that cannot feel grief anymore, the longing of creatures that have forgotten how to long for anything. There is a quote attributed to Sarek in the philosophical texts his dynasty preserved through the long exile that seems like the right note on which to contemplate all of this. He wrote that through technology, they had thought to defeat the natural order. But the onset of eternity could not be denied forever. The universe would see them humbled for their presumption. Their bodies had been removed from mortality's grasp. Their souls had been bartered away for technological baubles and the trappings of power. What remained for existence to attack was their minds. Sooner or later, they would all be lost to madness. He wrote that while knowing he might be the first, the Necrons are the galaxy's oldest survivors and its most recent tragedy. They won the war they started. They defeated the gods they served. They endured the 60 million years of sleep that their victory required. They are awakening, right now, all across the galaxy, into a universe that does not know what to do with them, and that they do not fully know what to do with themselves. They are immortal, and they are suffering. They are powerful beyond almost any reckoning. Yes, and they are hollow. They are ancient, and they are in some fundamental sense already dead. And somewhere in the living metal of every one of them, buried under the programming and the command protocols and the 60 million years of accumulated damage to whatever passed for their inner lives, there is the ghost of a person who just wanted to live a little longer. The brutal life of a Necron is not one of constant battle and glorious conquest, though there is certainly battle. It is not the horror movie nightmare of the relentless undead, though there is certainly horror. It is something quieter and more personal, and, in its own strange way, more devastating than either of those things. It is the life of a being who reached for everything and found when they opened their hand. Yet that the thing they wanted most was the one thing they had given up to get here. What the Necrons are living, if living is even the right word, is the longest possible answer to the question of what you sacrifice when you trade everything you are for the certainty of continuing to exist. They traded warmth for durability. They traded feeling for longevity. They traded the capacity for joy and love and the exquisite particular pain of being mortal for the cold, precisely engineered certainty of never having to end. And 60 million years later, they are still here, and the galaxy around them is alive and warm and full of the things they surrendered. And somewhere in the depths of every tomb world, in the silence between the footsteps of the Canoptech Guardians and the green glow of standby eye lenses, as something that might be called longing moves through the corridors of dead cities, searching for something it cannot name and cannot find and will never stop looking for. That is the brutal life of a Necron. Not the battles, not the technology, not the ancient grudges and the dynastic politics and the scheming of immortal minds with too much time and too little feeling. The brutal part is the silence. The brutal part is the echo. The brutal part is living forever without anything to live for. If this video connected with you in any way, if the story of the Necrons left you with that particular flavor of thoughtful melancholy that good lore always produces, I would genuinely appreciate you hitting the like button. It does real, concrete things for how many people get to hear these stories, and stories like this one deserve to be heard. And if you want to keep sitting with these ideas, keep exploring the dark corners of this universe we all love so much, subscribing to the channel means you will be here for whatever we look at next. There is so much more. The galaxy of the far future is vast and strange and full of things that reward the slow, careful kind of attention we try to bring to them here on Q on 40,000. Thank you for your time. Stay curious. Sleep well. End of script. The technology of eternity, living metal, and the horror of coming back. One of the things that makes the Necron existence so philosophically strange and so difficult for the other races of the galaxy to process when they encounter it is the technology that underpins it. The living metal, the necrodermis, from which every Necron body is constructed, is one of the most remarkable materials in the known universe. Not remarkable in the way that the Aeldari's wraithbone is remarkable, not primarily as a psychic medium or a spiritual conduit, but remarkable in the way that something alive is remarkable, the way a tree is remarkable, in that it does not merely exist as an inert material, but responds, adapts, and repairs itself in ways that conventional metallurgy cannot approach. Necrodermis was originally invented by the Necrontyre as a hull material for their spacecraft. Traveling between stars requires materials that can resist the cumulative damage of micrometeorite impacts, cosmic radiation, thermal stress at extreme ranges, and the simple fact that the void is not a friendly environment for anything constructed from conventional alloys. The Necrontyre engineers who developed Necrodermis discovered, in the process of perfecting the material for spacecraft use, that they had created something that was in some meaningful sense alive, not conscious, not capable of independent thought or action, but alive in the sense that it responded to damage by attempting to repair it, drawing on available energy and the molecular architecture of its surroundings to restore itself to its original configuration. The hull of a Necrontyre spacecraft could absorb significant damage and, given time and energy, actually regenerate the affected sections. This was not a designed feature. This was an emergent property of the material itself, discovered accidentally, and then, once discovered, refined and exploited systematically. When the Citan proposed biotransference, as the plan to use Necrodermis as the new substrate for Necrontyre consciousness was not accidental. The Citan had been watching the Necrontyre develop their technology for a very long time, and they had seen the potential of this self-repairing material for something very specific, a body that could not easily be destroyed, a vessel for consciousness that would keep repairing itself as long as any significant portion of it remained, a form of immortality that was mechanical rather than biological, but was, from the Citan's perspective, more robust than any biological system because it did not depend on the fragile chemistry of organic life. The living metal bodies of the Necrons are genuinely extraordinary by any technical standard. When a Necron is hit by weapons fire, the Necrodermis responds almost immediately. Small imperfections, more minor damage, surface ablation from energy weapons, all of this begins repairing itself within seconds. Billions of molecular-scale repair units embedded in the Necrodermis structure, flowing toward the damage and filling it in. The technical documentation of the Adeptus Mechanicus, in the classified reports that the Imperium's scholars have produced on the subject of Necron biology, describes the self-repair process as something that defies their current understanding of material science. The material is not simply resilient, it is adaptive. It can, given time, learn to repair forms of damage it has never experienced before. This is why engaging Necrons in sustained combat is so psychologically exhausting. You hit them, they go down, and then the repair process starts. And you have to either apply enough damage fast enough to overwhelm the self-repair rate, or you have to accept that what you hit is already getting back up. The reanimation protocols that govern this process are something even more complex. When damage exceeds the local repair capacity, when a Necron's Necrodermis body has been damaged beyond what the onboard systems can address in the field, a remarkable process begins. The Necron's consciousness, and whatever remains of its functional body, are teleported through the same quantum phase technology that the Necrons use for their weapons, back to the nearest tomb complex. There, the body is reconstructed in a stasis chamber, the molecular architecture rebuilt from available Necrodermis feedstock, the engrams reinstalled, and eventually the Necron is ready to deploy again. From a purely military standpoint, this is staggering. An army that, absent truly overwhelming damage, simply doesn't stay dead. That regenerates in the field from anything short of complete atomization and retreats to be fully rebuilt from anything worse. Tacticians who fight Necrons for the first time often have difficulty adapting to this because their entire training and experience is built around the assumption that when you destroy an enemy unit, it is destroyed. But here is the thing the pure military analysis misses. There is a cost. The lore is quite explicit about this. Every time a Necron goes through the reanimation process, every time its engrams are transferred out of a damaged body and reinstalled in a rebuilt one, the engrams themselves suffer further degradation. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but incrementally. And a small percentage of the data is corrupted, lost, or subtly altered in the transfer. A Necron that has been destroyed and rebuilt once is very slightly less complete than it was before. A Necron that has been through this process 100 times has lost something meaningful. A Necron warrior that has been recycled through the reanimation protocols over millennia of Awakening-era warfare is, statistically, one of the most thoroughly hollowed individuals in the galaxy, the last traces of who it was before the furnaces worn down to almost nothing by the accumulated costs of its own immortality. This is the darkest joke in the entire Necron existence, and it has no punchline. The technology that preserves them is the technology that destroys them. Every resurrection takes something away. Yet the immortality they bought with their souls is itself consuming what little of those souls survived the purchase. The mechanism of survival is also the mechanism of erasure. They cannot stop dying, and they cannot stop losing themselves in the process of coming back. And there is no exit from this loop, because the alternative to continuing the loop is simply stopping existing entirely, which would be the final victory of everything they have been fighting against, since the Necrontire first looked up at their killing sun and decided they refused to accept it. There is a word in the Necron lexicon for what the most damaged, most frequently rebuilt units experience in their later existence. The lore describes it as the Long Dark, the state in which a Necron has been rebuilt so many times that even the ghost of a personality is gone, leaving nothing but the core programming, the most fundamental command architecture that drives the basic warrior behaviors. These units continue to function. They respond to orders. They raise their weapons and fire them and march in their silent rows. But whatever was recognizably a person behind the eyes is simply no longer there, replaced entirely by the automated systems that were always running underneath. This is the terminus of the Necron experience, not death. Something worse than death. There is a reason the more self-aware Necron nobles sometimes choose to let a deeply damaged subordinate phase out permanently, rather than send it through the reanimation protocols again. They understand, in their cold and mechanical way, that at some point, the kindest thing is to let what remains of the person go, rather than perpetuate the machine that wears its face, the cryptex. Scientists in a kingdom of echoes. If the Necron warriors represent the average experience of Necron existence, and the overlords represent its extremes, the cryptex occupy a strange middle space that deserves particular attention. The cryptex are the Necron's scientific and technological elite. Before the Great Sleep, they were the inheritors of the extraordinary scientific tradition the Necrontyr had developed under the pressure of their shortened lives, carrying on the work of understanding and extending the boundaries of what was possible. They were the ones who had worked alongside Illuminor Ceres on the biotransference process, the ones who had developed the weapons technologies that won the war in heaven, the ones who maintained the tomb world systems during the Great Sleep, and who, now that the awakening has begun, continue that work of maintenance and development. The cryptex are defined, more than almost any other class of Necron, by their relationship to knowledge, specifically to the pursuit of it. Because in a race where almost every other motivation has been stripped away, where the great majority of the population experiences something too limited to be called purpose, the cryptex have retained something that drives them forward in a way that is recognizable as genuine intellectual curiosity. Whether that curiosity is experienced the way organic beings experience curiosity, with the quick excitement of the new question. But the pleasure of the investigation, the satisfaction of the answer, is genuinely unclear. The cryptexts themselves cannot answer this question reliably because the introspective machinery that would allow them to compare their current experience to their pre-biotransference memory of what curiosity felt like is itself suspect, a mechanical system interpreting degraded organic data. What is observable is that the cryptexts pursue knowledge with a dedication and intensity that distinguishes them from every other Necron class. They run experiments. They study the mechanics of the universe with tools so sophisticated that the Adeptus Mechanicus, who revere technology as close to divine, would spend 1,000 years trying to understand their theoretical framework. But they manipulate the fundamental forces of reality with the practiced ease of craftsmen working familiar materials. Dimensional dissonance, singularity manipulation, atomic transmutation, temporal looping. These are not theoretical concepts to the cryptexts, but working technologies that they deploy with the casual confidence of absolute mastery. The various types of cryptech represent different specializations within this broad pursuit. The plasmancers work with the raw energies of the cosmos, manipulating electromagnetic forces at scales that make ordinary Necron weapons look modest. The psychomancers, despite the prefix, do not use psychic powers in the warp-based sense, instead wielding technologies that interact with the psychological states of organic beings in ways that produce effects indistinguishable from psychic terror. The geomancers specialize in the deep geology and structural integrity of tomb worlds, the beings most likely to know exactly where a planet's tectonic fault lines are and how to make the surface above them deeply unpleasant for anyone trying to stand on it. The chronomancers are perhaps the most remarkable and certainly among the most disturbing. These cryptexts work with time itself, manipulating temporal flow in localized areas, creating pockets of accelerated or decelerated time around their positions, looping moments backward to undo damage or forward to age enemies prematurely. The chronomancer, Orikan, the diviner, one of the most notable figures in this category, does not merely manipulate time locally, but claims to be able to predict and potentially alter future timelines through his calculations, and a claim that the law treats with appropriate ambiguity about whether it represents genuine temporal prediction or elaborate mechanical extrapolation from available data. What all of these specialists share, beyond their technical focus, is the isolation that comes with being among the most cognitively active members of a race defined by cognitive diminishment. The cryptexts are sharp enough to be aware of what has been lost. They are precise enough in their thinking to map the contours of the absence accurately. They know, in concrete and specific terms, what they cannot do, what they cannot feel, what they cannot be, in ways that the mindless warriors simply do not register. This is, in its own fashion, a particular kind of suffering. The most honest accounts in the lore suggest that some cryptexts redirect this awareness into their work, at using the precision and depth of scientific inquiry as a substitute for the emotional engagement that has been taken from them. The work becomes not just what they do, but what they are, the only domain where the quality and intensity of their cognitive activity approaches something that might, in better circumstances, have been called passion. Others take a different path. The most troubled cryptexts are those who have turned their analytical faculties on the question of what was done to their race, who have spent centuries or millennia trying to understand the exact mechanism of how biotransference stripped away the soul, hoping that if they can understand the mechanism precisely enough, they can find a way to reverse it. The Nephrek dynasty's cryptexts are particularly notable in this regard, outworking at the intersection of biology and metaphysics in an attempt to find a path back to organic existence. They have not succeeded yet, but they are still working. Every day, in the laboratories hidden in the deep levels of their tomb complexes, the cryptexts continue their experiments, running tests, taking measurements, building toward understanding that may never arrive, or may arrive in a moment of clarity that transforms everything. In that persistence, in that mechanical but genuine determination to keep asking the question even when the question resists answering, there is something that might be the last recognizable trace of the Necrontier's most fundamental characteristic: the refusal to accept that some problems cannot be solved. Against the young races, the Necrons in the 41st millennium. The Necrons who have awakened into the 41st millennium are doing so in a galaxy that is, by any reasonable measure, worse than the one they went to sleep in. When the Silent King ordered the Great Sleep, the galaxy's major crises were the Enslaver Plague, the rising of the Aeldari civilization, and the general aftermath of the War in Heaven. These were serious problems. The Enslavers alone threatened to consume all psionic life in the galaxy, and the Aeldari's ascendancy represented a genuine long-term challenge to any Necron plan to reclaim their former dominion. But none of those things were the Great Rift. The Great Rift, which the Imperium in its characteristic flair for understatement calls the Cicatrix Maledictum, is a tear in reality itself, and a wound in the fabric of space-time that runs across a significant portion of the galaxy, separating the Imperium Nihilus from the relatively more stable Imperium Sanctus. Through this rift pour the forces of the warp in quantities that would have seemed impossible before its opening, the energies of chaos spilling into real space across thousands of light-years, manifesting as demonic incursions on a scale that the galaxy has not seen since the War in Heaven itself. For most of the galaxy's inhabitants, the Great Rift is simply a catastrophe. For the Necrons, it is a catastrophe that has a very particular meaning. The Necrons were the ones who, in the ancient past, first developed technologies to suppress the warp. The blackstone pylons that the Imperium now finds scattered across dozens of worlds, which they have been using imperfectly and not always understanding what they are doing, are Necron technology, designed precisely for the purpose of stabilizing real space against warp incursion. The Necrons built them because they understood, even 60 million years ago, that an unstable warp was dangerous for everyone, including beings who cannot access the warp at all. Some Necron dynasties have responded to the Great Rift by deploying these pylon networks aggressively, creating what the Imperium has come to call the Pariah Nexus, a region of space where the warp's influence is dramatically reduced, where psychic powers function poorly or not at all, and where the boundaries of real space are held firm against the pressure of the immaterium. This serves Necron interest directly. Since the Necrons' total inability to use the warp means that their competitive advantage is maximized in environments where no one else can use it either. But it also, and the law is carefully ambiguous about whether this is deliberate or simply a side effect, helps stabilize the galaxy against the kind of chaos-driven catastrophe that would make reclaiming anything here essentially pointless. The Silent King has his own relationship to the Great Rift that is worth examining. Zarek returned to the galaxy in part because of the Tyranid threat, which he understood to be incompatible with his long-term goal of finding biological vessels for Necron minds. But the Great Rift represents a different kind of threat to the same goal. A galaxy consumed by chaos corruption is a galaxy where viable organic species may not long survive, and where the resources required to reverse biotransference would be unavailable even if the process were understood. So Zarek finds himself in the extraordinary position of having genuine reasons to care about the survival of species he would, in an uncomplicated version of the Necron worldview, simply be trying to subjugate. He does not feel warmth toward humanity, or the Aeldari, or the Toe in any way that organic beings would recognize as warmth. But he has calculated that their survival is currently necessary for his own long-term plans, and calculated interest for the Silent King functions in many of the same practical ways that caring functions for beings with souls. The day-to-day reality of the awakened Necrons interacting with the other species of the 41st millennium produces encounters that range from the deeply strange to the genuinely terrifying. Consider a standard encounter, the kind that happens thousands of times across the galaxy as tomb worlds continue their awakening sequence. An Imperial mining operation on a world that has been considered uninhabited for centuries is interrupted when the ground opens up and Necron warriors begin emerging. The miners, none of whom has ever seen a Necron before, are confronted with skeletal metal figures moving with slow, jerky precision, their eyes burning with cold green fire, carrying weapons that the miners' data slates have no category for. The workers run. Some of them make it. Those who don't are hit by Gauss fire. And the lore is quite specific about what that looks like. The beams strip matter at the molecular level, which means a human being hit by sustained Gauss fire doesn't so much die as gradually cease to exist. Their constituent molecules disassembled layer by layer. It is, in the lore's own framing, extremely painful, for as long as the target remains alive enough to feel pain. The Necron warriors executing this do not have opinions about it. They do not feel satisfaction or regret, or the particular grim efficiency that a well-trained Imperial guardsman might feel when doing their duty. They identify targets. Their targeting systems acquire solutions. Their weapons fire. It is the same whether the targets are human miners or Aeldari warriors or orc mobs. The warriors process it all identically. But because at the level of their cognitive architecture, everything is equally a threat to be neutralized, and the tomb world is to be defended, the Necron overlord who commands this tomb world may have a richer response. If they are the kind of lord who has retained enough personality for a richer response to be possible, they might note the technological level of the intruders. They might make a cold calculation about whether the presence of this mining operation indicates a larger Imperial presence in the system that will require more decisive action. They might, if they are one of the more unusual Necron lords, be genuinely curious about what these soft biological creatures were doing on their world. They will not, almost certainly, feel guilty about what their warriors have done to the miners. Or the absence of guilt is worth examining carefully, because it is easy to interpret Necron violence as cruelty, as conscious malice, as the deliberate infliction of suffering. But the lore is consistent about this. The Necrons are not, for the most part, sadistic. They do not enjoy the suffering of their enemies because they cannot enjoy anything. The efficiency of their killing is not the efficiency of someone who has perfected their technique and takes professional pride in the result. It is the efficiency of a very old, very powerful automated system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The horror of the Necrons is not that they are evil. It is that they are indifferent, in the same way that a natural disaster is indifferent. A hurricane does not hate the people it destroys. A wildfire does not enjoy the destruction it causes. These things simply happen, according to the physics of their nature, and the suffering they produce is a side effect rather than a goal. The Necrons are like that, writ intelligent. They have enough cognitive capacity to make strategic choices, to distinguish between kinds of threats and respond proportionally, to cooperate with other factions when it serves their interests. But the emotional substrate that would give those choices moral weight, that would allow them to register the suffering they cause as something that matters, is simply absent in the vast majority of them. This is, in certain ways, the most frightening thing about them. The endless war and the question without answer. So where does this leave us? The Necrons are waking up across a galaxy in crisis, or their numbers are diminished from what they were before the Great Sleep, but still represent, in aggregate, one of the largest military forces in the known galaxy. Their technology remains the most advanced in the setting, by most assessments significantly ahead of anything the other major factions can field. Their immortality makes attrition warfare against them uniquely challenging, and they are deeply, fundamentally broken. Not in a way that makes them less dangerous, in a way that makes them more tragic. The most powerful species in the galaxy is also the most hollow, operating at a fraction of what they were intended to be, pursuing goals that are in many cases vestigial echoes of motivations that the actual people who had them no longer exist to feel. The ordinary Necron warrior. He standing in its tomb world or marching across a battlefield is carrying something it can never put down and never examine. The remnant of a person, the fragmentary ghost of someone who wanted very much to live, compressed into a series of behavioral programs that mimic the surface of that person's intentions while containing almost none of their substance. The Necron overlord, scheming and planning and pursuing the elaborate dynastic games that give their existence whatever texture it possesses, is doing something that would look, from the outside, like ambition, like purpose, like the kind of engaged motivation that characterizes a full and meaningful life. But from the inside, and in the rare moments when those lords turn their analytical capacities on their own experience and try to assess what they are actually feeling as they pursue their various agendas, the answer is not encouraging. There is something. There is motion, direction, the execution of plans. But the warmth that should be there, the sense of meaning that transforms the pursuit of a goal from mere activity into genuine living, that is absent in ways that are difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The destroyers resolved this problem by deciding that if they cannot feel the warmth of life, they will at least feel the cold satisfaction of ending it. They turned their emptiness outward, made the absence of feeling into a philosophy of negation. If you cannot add to the universe, you can at least reduce it to something that matches your interior. The flayed ones resolved it differently, or tried to, reaching toward the warm biological life they can smell but cannot feel, draping its stolen remnants over themselves like a costume that fits all wrong, knowing that it doesn't work, and doing it anyway, because the alternative is to simply stand still in the dark and process the fact that you will never be warm again. The great lords resolved it with obsession, with the consuming projects and fixations that fill their endless centuries, with enough moment-to-moment occupation to stave off the contemplation of the void. And Zarek resolved it, or tries to resolve it, by not resolving it. By carrying the guilt and the grief and the memory fully, as by refusing the mercy of forgetting that most of his kind were granted involuntarily, by sitting with the knowledge of what he did and what it cost, and using that discomfort as the fuel for the one project that might, in the longest possible view, actually provide something approaching redemption. The reversal of biotransference, the return of souls to the soulless, the recovery of what was stolen from an entire civilization by a god who wanted lunch. It may be impossible. The law does not commit to whether it is or isn't. This is one of the great unresolved questions hanging over the Necron narrative, a question that the current state of the setting leaves genuinely open. Is there a path back to organic existence? Is there a species in the galaxy whose biology could serve as a vessel for Necron consciousness? Is there a way to undo something that was done 60 million years ago by beings who are now shattered fragments of themselves, imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths, their knowledge gone with their coherence? We do not know. The Necrons do not know. And in the not knowing, in that enormous space of uncertainty that sits at the center of their entire civilizational project, there is something that is almost hope. Not the warm, embodied hope of a living creature who can feel the possibility of a better future resonating through their body like a held note. Something colder, more mechanical, but no less real for that. The logical acknowledgement that the problem has not been proven insoluble. The continued allocation of resources to the search. The maintenance, however fragile and however degraded by the long passage of time, and of the intention to keep trying. In a race that has lost the capacity for hope, the persistence of the search is the closest thing available. And that persistence is, in its cold and mechanical way, the most Necron-tire thing about the Necrons, the most human thing about them. The echo of a civilization that refused, even when everything was against it, to stop looking for a way to survive. They wanted to live. They still do, in whatever way they remain capable of wanting anything. 60 million years later, and they have not stopped. That is the brutal life of a Necron, and it is, in the end, also something close to magnificent. in the bleak and grinding and inextinguishable way that all forms of perseverance are magnificent, even the ones that have forgotten what they are persevering for. But the galaxy of the 41st millennium is full of horrors. The Necrons are one of them. But they are a horror that carries within it the ghost of a tragedy, the echo of a people who made the worst possible bargain in the name of the most understandable possible wish, and who are still paying the price for it, in the darkness of their tomb worlds and the silence between battles, in the long mechanical march of their endless, hollow, irreplaceable years. They are still here, and they do not know whether that is the victory or the defeat. If you made it to the end of this one, genuinely thank you. This is the kind of lore that I love sitting with, the kind that doesn't resolve neatly, that sits in the chest a little bit after you close the video. If it did that for you too, the like button is right there, and every click genuinely helps more people find this channel and these stories. And if you want to stay in this corner of the galaxy, to keep exploring these dark and remarkable and endlessly fascinating corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe with me, subscribing to Q on 40k means you will be here for everything that comes next. We have so much more to cover. The galaxy is vast and the lore runs deep, and we are only getting started. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one. End of script. A closer look at the dynasties. Different ways to be empty. One of the things that the Warhammer 40,000 lore does particularly well with the Necrons in recent editions is illustrate how different the various dynasties are from one another despite their shared origins and their shared curse. If biotransference reduced most of the Necrontia to automatons, the process was not perfectly uniform. The nobility who came through with their personalities intact, and even some unusual individuals from lower castes, developed distinct identities over the course of millions of years of existence, identities that now define the dynasties they lead and the tomb worlds they govern. The Sautek dynasty, led by Immertek the Stormlord, is perhaps the most conventionally aggressive of the major dynasties, the one most overtly engaged in the project of territorial expansion and military dominance. The Sautek under Immertek operate with a crisp, systematic efficiency that reflects their pharaoh's character. No wasted effort, no sentiment, and no distractions from the central objective of growing the dynasty's power and demonstrating its superiority to anyone who requires demonstrating it to. They are the Necron faction, most likely to simply conquer a world and incorporate it into their growing empire without elaborate preliminary maneuvering. The Nihilak dynasty has a reputation for being among the most territorial and possessive of the Necron dynasties, deeply invested in maintaining their borders and extremely hostile to any intrusion into what they consider their domain. The Nihilak's tomb worlds are among the most heavily defended in the galaxy, their overlords the most likely to pursue full military campaigns in response to what other factions might consider minor provocations. There is something in the Nihilak's particular form of obsession with territorial integrity that reads, in the lore, as a kind of defensive psychological mechanism, a way of creating a clearly defined domain within which the boundlessness of their existence has edges and limits, and therefore something resembling shape. The Mefrit dynasty has oriented its military identity around its weapons systems, specifically the development and deployment of the most destructive possible applications of Gauss technology. Where the Sautek favors strategic brilliance and the Nihilak favors overwhelming territorial defense, the Mefrit favors simply ending engagements as rapidly as possible through the application of firepower, so intense that there is nothing left to resist. The Mefrit's particular gift is the ability to modify their Gauss weapons to strip through even the most heavily shielded targets, to find the molecular weak point in any material, and exploit it with complete ruthlessness. The Zarakan dynasty is unique among the major dynasties because it was the personal dynasty of the Silent King himself, and its culture and values reflect the particular character of the being who shaped it over millions of years of exile and guilt. The Zarakan Necrons have a certain gravity to them, a weight of purpose that distinguishes them from the more narrowly focused ambitions of other dynasties. They serve as the primary enforcers of the Silent King's agenda, and that agenda, to unite the Necrons, address the existential threats facing the galaxy, and ultimately find a way to reverse biotransference, is perhaps the most humane purpose any Necron dynasty has articulated, even if the methods by which the Sarkhan pursue it are not always distinguishable from those of any other dynasty. And then there are the stranger cases, the Novok dynasty, whose Necrons have taken the red-stained aesthetics of hand-to-hand combat as their defining characteristic, who mark themselves with the blood of their enemies in rituals whose exact meaning even they may no longer fully understand, but which connect them to something ancient and visceral and perhaps slightly more alive feeling than the cold mathematical precision of most Necron warfare. The Nephrek dynasty, whose skin of golden light and whose entire civilizational project is oriented around the question of reversal, or of finding the path back to biological existence, who pursue their goal with the intensity of people who have not given up on the most important thing they have ever wanted. Each of these dynasties represents a different answer to the question that every Necron, consciously or not, is always trying to answer. What do you do with eternity when eternity has been stripped of everything that makes existence worthwhile? How do you fill the void when the void is yourself? Some fill it with conquest, some with preservation, some with destruction, some with the patient, meticulous pursuit of a redemption that may never come. None of them have found the answer, but they keep looking. The battle and the return. What war actually looks like. When a Necron army deploys for battle, yet the experience for the opposing force is immediately and fundamentally different from fighting any other faction in the galaxy. The silence is the first thing that strikes most accounts. Necron warriors do not cry out. They do not issue battle cries or orders in voices that carry across the battlefield. There are no drums, no horns, no mechanical equivalents of the auditory ceremony that biological armies use to build morale and signal intent. There is only the low, continuous hum of the reanimation protocols and canoptech systems, the emerald glow of eye lenses in whatever light is available, and the soft shuffle of metal feet on whatever surface is being crossed. Then the Gauss weapons open up, and the silence is replaced with something that sounds, in multiple accounts, less like conventional weapons fire and more like tearing. It's like the sound of the fundamental structure of matter being gently but insistently undone. The beams do not crack or boom, they strip, and the sound of stripping is its own particular wrongness. For the Necron warriors executing this engagement, the experience, to whatever extent experience is the right word for what they have, is a stream of sensory input and mechanical response. Targets identified, solutions calculated, weapons cycling through their discharge sequences, the constant passive monitoring of the repair systems, the occasional brief interruption of a heavier impact that temporarily disrupts.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.